You're listening to Seek Travel Ride, a podcast sharing bike adventures from people from all over the world. And this episode is sponsored by Old Man Mountain, makers of the most durable bike racks out there. If you want to head out on an adventure, you need to strap gear onto your bike, and Old Man Mountain have you covered in a myriad of ways. Head to oldmanmountain.com to find out more. Now, on to today's episode. Hello everyone, Bella Malloy here, host of Seek Travel Ride. Welcome back to another midweek episode of the show where I'm trying to keep your fuel and stoke for bike adventure travel fired up. If you can hear my voice, I unfortunately am still sick. Day number 10 of what I've discovered is COVID. And it's sort of kicked me in the guts a little bit. But like perhaps many of you, I've tried to fill my thoughts up with focusing forward on the bike adventures I want to be taking. Funnily enough, I found myself this week looking back on some videos I'd taken last year when I had met up with adventurer Claire Wyatt, and we had 3 incredible days of riding in the Pyrenees. And it's got me fired up for big adventures to come when I'm clear of this horrible virus. In the meantime, I have got a great story to share with you this week, coming from an adventurer called Helen Watson. And Helen is actually sharing an experience which she had on her honeymoon. That's right. So Helen in 2010 got married, and she and her lovely husband decided the best way to spend a honeymoon was to ride their bikes from Glasgow to China. So she's sharing some experiences on the road from that very trip. No one tells us this story better than Helen herself, so let's hear all about it.
Hi Bella, thanks so much for inviting me to be part of the pod. My name's Helen Watson, and in 2010 I cycled from Glasgow in Scotland to China with my husband Ed. And I guess you could say it was kind of an extended honeymoon. We'd only just got married. And what better way to test out a marriage than cycling thousands of kilometres together, potentially enduring various bouts of food poisoning and lots of hard mountain passes. So that was really a great start to getting married. But I guess that wasn't really the reason we set out. I think I've just always had this real fascination about how the world on our doorstep changes step by step or pedal by pedal to somewhere that seems completely alien, like China. I think ultimately Eurasia is actually one landmass, but we put up lots and lots of different borders and artificial barriers to that. I grew up in Switzerland and I was born in the 1980s, and I distinctly remember the Berlin Wall coming down and people coming to Switzerland with pieces of the Berlin Wall and everyone celebrating. And I suppose that's a very visible emblem of, what borders mean, and also, in a way, just how irrelevant they should be. So for me, it was really about trying to understand those places in between. And I had quite a few friends growing up who were from Turkey and Afghanistan and Russia. And so I had a lot of fascination with, I guess, that kind of part of the world. So it was really exciting when we eventually did set off from our doorstep one July morning, very heavily laden. We actually ditched quite a bunch of kit on our first night when we stayed with my brother-in-law. But over the following kilometres, we really, I guess, just kind of got into our stride. And it was amazing how after a couple of weeks, it really felt like we could just keep going and going. Although I don't think I ever really believed we would reach China until we got there. We had a plan to sort of head eastwards, but without too much of a fixed agenda. We cycled through Western Europe and into the Balkans to Serbia and Bosnia and Montenegro and Croatia and Albania and Greece, and then into Turkey. And then we took a kind of random decision to cycle a loop around Syria for a month, kind of to escape the cold winter, and then headed across the high passes of eastern Turkey in March. There was quite a lot of snow, and then through Iran and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, Tajikistan along the border with Afghanistan, and then into China, and eventually reaching Western China. And we'd cycled about 15,000 kilometres, and it had taken us 15 months. We weren't trying to be fast, we were trying to use cycling as a mode of exploring places and meeting people. And it was a really good way of doing that. I think being on a bike, you're very approachable. People can stop you, they can flag you down. Maybe they sometimes perhaps unnecessarily feel a bit of pity for you as well. And we found it was a really great way to meet and talk to people. I guess one of the places I'd like to focus on right now is Iran, because it's in the news so much. And actually, it's not really been that easy to travel to Iran since 2010, nor Syria, of course, because a year after we set off, the civil war started. There are various people that are setting out across these countries, and I've been following lots of interesting stuff online about that, but it's definitely a lot harder than it was. And I think Iran, obviously is facing a terrible situation at the moment. And even at that point, of course, the state had a reputation for really cracking down on dissent. And that was very apparent when we were in Iran, although our day-to-day experience was actually one of really overwhelming hospitality and curiosity of the Iranian people, which made it so amazing. I guess I could just sort of illustrate one example where that happened. Iranian food is absolutely delicious, and we were invited into lots of people's houses to have things like gourma sabzi and chicken fesenjoon, which is a pomegranate and walnut stew, and kuku sabzi, which is a herb omelette. And we'd spent a lot of time almost being hijacked and sort of invited into people's houses to come and sit with them and talk to their families and stuff like that. But weirdly, when we got to the capital, Tehran, it was around the time of Nowruz, which is the Iranian New Year, which is probably equivalent of going to, London at Christmas time or something like that. And a lot of places were shut, and the only place we could find to eat was a sort of American-style burger joint called Booth, which was basically a fake McDonald's. It had rip-off Coke and rip-off Big Macs in it. And so we reluctantly sat down and ate there. And then the following morning, I woke up to hear Ed just throwing up, being really, really unwell. And I thought, okay, well, this happens. Wasn't the first time we'd got food poisoning. But I headed off. I went out and got myself some bread and carrot jam for breakfast. And then when I came back, Ed was collapsed on the floor of the bathroom in our hotel room. And I was feeling pretty worried at that point. And I sort of leafed through our supply of antibiotics and our medical kit. And, we had some sort of basic medical diet, a tool we kind of dubbed the good shitting guide, which was a way of diagnosing what sort of food poisoning you got. And I figured out it was probably salmonella. Tried to get him to swallow some of the right antibiotics, but nothing was staying down. And I was quite worried at this point because Iran was under total trade embargo, so we'd come into the country with just over $1,000, I think it was, but that was it. There were no credit cards, no ability to do bank transfer or Western Union transfer or anything like that. So we kind of had the money we had. And I was thinking, if we have to go into hospital, how much is that going to cost? Are we going to be able to afford to pay? And if we can't, well, what then? So I spent a bit of time trying to phone the embassy, which promised medical assistance. Although they didn't want help, I thought they would be able to recommend a hospital to me that might accept some sort of deal in terms of payment. And I phoned, we did have insurance for this trip. We'd paid through the nose for a reasonably good, supposedly insurer, and they told us we would have sort of help, a 24-hour medical helpline, which I phoned, and it turned out to be bogus. So I didn't really have too much choice. And by this point, the hotel proprietor was banging on the door saying, are you okay? He was very concerned about Ed. And I relented and we phoned an ambulance. And I remember sitting in the ambulance with the sirens going and this paramedic managing an oxygen supply to Ed, because he was basically at this point pretty much totally incapacitated, and just thinking, what is going to happen? And before we left the hotel, I'd had the presence of mind to grab my passport and the money we had and fix my headscarf and manteau properly. So at that point, it was mandatory for women to wear a headscarf and a long covering. I mean, it still is, although that I think looking at pictures now from Iran, a lot of women are really pushing back against those rules. But I sort of checked that all my hair was covered and that I looked modest and respectful, and that because I really didn't at this point want to kind of stand out. And it was a good thing, because when we got to the hospital, I discovered that normally male patients are only admitted with a male relative. You have to have a relative with you, but they made an exception for me as a foreigner, so I was allowed into the male ward. And Ed was, busily hooked up to lots of drips. And I sort of waited for then a barrage of tests that they seemed to give him, an ECG and an ultrasound and an X-ray and all sorts of things, which I wasn't really quite sure were needed. But I was obviously grateful that he was being looked after. But all the time I was kind of thinking, this is now, the cost that is mounting up, and are we going to be able to afford this? And can I, what am I going to do? And already, if this had been the UK, we would have been into well in excess of £1,000. So eventually a doctor came round and started to, sort of talk to Ed once he'd recovered a bit, and interrogated him and asked him if he'd been drinking alcohol. So alcohol is totally prohibited, but, moonshine and methanol poisoning from moonshine is not uncommon. So perhaps a reasonable thing to ask a Western traveller. And then in the afternoon, he started to get a bit better. And eventually the time came and they said, it's ready for you to go. You need to go and pay now. So I went to this hatch and asked the clerk what was owed. And he wrote it out on this flimsy chitty and handed it to me. And it took me a moment to kind of register what the cost was. And I sort of did a double take, looked at it, checked the zeros were right. And I realised that it was $35. And I said, Tim, I kind of couldn't help myself. I was like, are you sure this is right? And he was like, oh yeah, no, absolutely. Because you're foreign visitors, the medical treatment's much cheaper for you, welcome to Iran. And I think that was just a really interesting experience. That was kind of, I suppose, in a way, a bit of an embodiment of the experience that we'd had just generally. I mean, regular people were really, really kind to us. I remember as well, like cycling up a hill and this guy slowing down in his car and handing us a cup of tea as we were cycling, kind of Tour de France Iranian style. People just would stop and, ply us with bread or oranges or sweets. One night, it was near Mashhad in eastern Iran. It was pitch black. We'd kind of overestimated, really. We'd cycled further than we were planning to that day. We had a really strong tailwind, but we'd got into an area as night fell where there wasn't really anywhere suitable to camp anymore. And I think probably a lot of long distance travellers will be familiar with that. As day comes to an end, you sort of play this game of, well, when should I stop? Should I carry on? Should I stop now? Should I carry on? And you have a sort of couple of hours sometimes of going backwards and forwards on that. And it had got dark and we were somewhere where there was, it was a big motorway and there was nowhere really suitable to camp. And we stopped to consult a map, and just this guy came out of an alleyway and just said to us, come with me, come to my house. And he knew nothing about us. And he just invited us into his house, and we went into his house, and we had dinner with his family, and they looked after us. And, no question of not providing hospitality. And I always think about that, and I think about our standards of hospitality here in Scotland, and really, just how different that is. And I've made a really conscious effort in the intervening years to try and be as hospitable as I can be. We had a really similar experience in Syria. People would just ply us with, tea, food. We stayed in a lot of people's houses. A group of young men once found us camping in the desert and insisted we come and stay in their house. And it's been really, really hard over the last basically 15 years to see what's happened in a lot of the places that we cycle through, especially Syria and Iran, and know that a lot of the people we met have been having a really challenging time. After coming back, I became involved in community refugee sponsorship here in Scotland, kind of inspired by a lot of the hospitality that I'd received, that Ed and I had received while we were travelling. And we did through that sponsor the first Syrian family to come to Scotland through community refugee sponsorship, which is a scheme that the Canadians have been doing for years and years and years, but is very, very new in the UK. And we've also hosted Ukrainian refugees in our house since. And I'm really grateful to the people that I met on the trip for kind of giving me that sense and that feeling of, I guess, in a way, like wanting to try and really connect with people and wanting, to give back. And so the trip was a long time ago, but it's one of the reasons why recently I've published a book about it. It was released in January, and it's really about, cycling and how cycling can really help bridge cultures and I guess bring people together. And it's meant to be a bit of an antidote to some of the stuff that's happening in the world right now. So if you're interested in that, please check it out. It's called Tea and Grit, a bicycle journey along the Silk Road, and it's available on any of the online retailers that you might think of, and you can also order it in through your local bookshop. Pleased to report that Ed and I are still happily married despite all of the dramas on the cycle trip, and I could certainly recommend taking a long trip like this with someone you love. I work in wildlife conservation and Ed's a geography teacher, and we live in the Scottish Highlands, and we still get out and do a lot of adventures together. I was just out on my skis yesterday. We've just had some of the best snow conditions for ski touring that we've had in quite a few years here. And we get out hill running and cycling and skiing and hiking a lot together still. And maybe planning our next big trip together once we finally pay off the mortgage. Thanks so much, Bella, for inviting me to be on the podcast.
Listeners, when I head away from home on my own bike adventures, there are a few things I always take with me, and having a VPN has become non-negotiable. Remote work and bike travel are just a fact of life for me now, especially as I split my time between Australia and France. I've been using NordVPN for around 4 years now, and it means that I can get on with all the boring life admin that isn't going away just because I'm on my own bike adventure. I can use public Wi-Fi to do things like banking, logging on from cafes, campgrounds, hotels, train stations and airports. And I always know NordVPN have got my back, giving me peace of mind that my data is protected. I like that Nord's simple and fast to use. It works on all of my devices. To get the best discount off your own NordVPN plan, go to nordvpn.com/STR. Our link's going to give you 4 extra months on their 2-year plan, and there's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link's in the podcast episode description box. Support the brands that are supporting this podcast. Now back to the episode. Oh, thank you so much, Helen. I absolutely loved so much about what you've shared with us here. First and foremost, what an awesome way to take a honeymoon, like to decide on a long-distance bike journey. And also, it very much didn't break either of you. Your relationship is still going, and it sounds like you're still taking adventures now as well. So it's only been great. But I think also such a massive journey like that and all those experiences shared together. You talked about how much that has been life-changing for you. And I mean, I guess probably as a couple, it's been life-changing as well. The other thing that I've thought about straight away here is that you're talking about a journey that was taken in 2010, 15 years ago. And we look at where the world is currently. There's a war raging now in Iran. And the areas that you're talking about then, it feels like how we were observing those areas 15 years ago, it hasn't changed at all, has it? And it's still an area which has turmoil and war and mystique and all those sort of things thrown into it. It really struck me that the thoughts that you went into these areas with in 2010 would be similar to someone going in there in our times now. And gosh. The other thing is just that idea of wanting to take a journey across such a huge landmass where we have these frontiers and borders, but where does the culture actually shift along the way?
And it's something, Helen, that I've thought about so many times when I've spoken to travellers who have ridden these long distances. And I've sort of said, sometimes the border and the frontier of a country from one nation to the next is so stark. There's like a geographical landmass or a mountain peak or a border river or something really defined, and you can say, okay, I can understand how they took this to be the definitive border. But often I've wondered, well, what does shift across those borders? And while you definitely observed many different culture shifts along the way, something that does warm my heart in what you've shared and what so many of my guests have shared in many, many episodes now is the constant theme that while the culture changes, often the kindness doesn't. And the kindness shown to you as complete strangers in a country often just keeps increasing as your trip unfolds. That story there with the hospital, and I could put myself in your shoes, just doing the mental math of panic of how am I going to afford this treatment, and also before even thinking of affording it, like putting yourself in the shoes of what's going on, how will we actually navigate getting treatment in the first place, and then to have that as a story where this extreme act of kindness and it just wasn't a thing there. That was dealt with. Your husband was treated. You weren't in huge debt. You were able to move on. And hearing then you talk about how that whole journey across, how this trip shaped you and your husband as people, taking on refugee sponsorship, being advocates in Scotland for refugees. I've often thought that people who take long journeys like this and have these type of stark experiences, obviously it does change you, and the level of empathy within you levels up so much, and that's so clear in what you've done now as well. It's just, an absolutely incredible story, and often makes me think that I wish everybody could take a bike adventure to experience a different country totally starkly from what they're used to, and to sort of reflect on the changes within themselves that has. So many of my long distance bike travelers that I have interviewed, it's so clear to me, like, it's deeply ingrained, that want to pay it forward constantly, because you are overwhelmed with kindness that we just don't get in our normal days, and that it really comes across so well here. Listeners, now Helen has, as she said, written a book all about this, and if you're like me, you're definitely going to want to get your hands on it. It is called Tea and Grit, A Bicycle Journey Along the Silk Road. I've got a link in the podcast show notes to where you can look to make a purchase of the book. But as Helen said, it's definitely worth checking it out, and it's available on all major online retailers. Or how about we do something even more special and help our local community out? Get yourself to a local bookshop and order it in. And Helen, I would definitely welcome a longer podcast interview with you to learn more about this amazing adventure and yourself as well. Thanks for sharing your story with us. Okay, now it's time for me to shout out you, my incredible super fans who have gone above and beyond and shown your love for the show by buying me some coffees. These virtual coffees keep my internal stoke for the podcast fired up, I have to say. And it always fills me with so much happiness just to read the messages assigned to them as well, because it gives me an insight into how much you're actually like tuning into the show to get stoke for your own bike adventures too. So this week I want to give a shout out to NJ Guilford, and you have said, "Hey Bella, I'm sat in my tent enjoying a coffee, and I thought it's about time as an avid listener to your excellent podcast that I bought you some coffees. What am I doing sat in a tent in the middle of winter in North Norfolk, UK, you may wonder? Well, I've got a bigger year of cycling ahead of me in 2026, and one of the things that I need to do is make sure that I test all of my kit in all weathers. So I've decided each month this year, I'm at least going to do an overnighter in preparation for the big one that will see me tackling the Great Divide mountain bike route, setting off from Banff in August with the objective of getting it done down at the Mexican border before I turn 66 at the start of October. Before then, in addition to my regular riding and training, my wife and I will be setting off on what will be our 10th annual cycle tour in France, which normally sees us doing between 600 and 1,000 miles, enjoying the countryside of France, staying in the quirkiest of places we can find, and eating and drinking as much as we want because we know we're going to burn it all off. I'm then going to be tackling the Marcher Castles Way in Wales with my son in July. Also, I'll be continuing to help with regular coaching of students at the local SEN school. plus their annual 100-mile challenge, which is an overnighter. Keep up the good work and enjoy your coffees. Regards, Nick. Oh, Nick, what an awesome message. And I love so much about this. I love your adventures. I love that you're there getting the weather practice in, making sure that your equipment's going to hold up. And whoa, incredible, the Great Divide mountain bike route. That's going to be absolutely mind-blowing for you. And gosh, you've got to keep in touch with me and let me know how the whole adventure goes. What a huge goal for 2026. And who knows, maybe depending on where you're riding in France, maybe we'll cross paths somewhere. Maybe at a boulangerie by the sounds of it. I'm definitely a stickler for eating good food. But thank you so much for buying me some coffees. And next I have Birds and Bikes and Ballet. That's you, Katrina. Hello. Katrina Hayes, a previous podcast guest. You have said, congrats on 3 years of engaging storytelling. No one is better suited to unlock the details of epic adventures than you. I love your curiosity and sense of shared humanity. Oh, thank you so much, Katrina. And actually, speaking of Great Divide mountain bike route, I mean, you did that route to celebrate your 50th birthday. I'm sure that if Nick got in touch with you, you could probably swap a lot of stories and experiences there. But thanks so much for being a legend and supporting the podcast. And listeners, if you want to be like Nick and Katrina and also show your support for the show, you can do so by simply heading to buymeacoffee.com/Seek Travel Ride. Buy me a few virtual coffees and let me know what is it that you love about this podcast and where is your next bike adventure going to be taking you. And until the next episode, I'm Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.
And that's the end of the episode, listeners. Don't forget, be sure to check out Old Man Mountain, who are supporting Seek Travel Ride this year. I am a massive fan of their gear, and I 100% recommend you check out the Hemlock bags and flip cages. A super handy and robust bag and cargo cage system. I love them, and I'm sure you will too. Head to oldmanmountain.com and support the brands that support this podcast.